Bom dia, estamos de volta à Tenda dos Autores, a segunda mesa da Flip. A Flip, entre as melhores coisas que a gente pode fazer é promover o encontro com os nossos grandes autores que a gente já conhecia, como foi o caso com a Sarlo agora há pouco, e também apresentar aqueles grandes criadores que ainda não são plenamente conhecidos no Brasil. E é o caso dessa mesa de hoje, que a gente apresenta com muito orgulho. David Hare, por favor, venha ao palco. E quem faz a mediação é o Ángel Quintana Gurria, que está morando aqui na tenda, já é a terceira mesa que ele faz para a gente. Ángel, muito obrigado. O Ángel é jornalista do Financial Times e ele fez a antologia Other Carnivals, que é uma seleta de prosa brasileira publicada no Reino Unido. Bem-vindos. Manda ver. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado, Paulo. Dá para ouvir bem? Sim. Ok. Boa tarde a todo mundo e bem-vindos a esta mesa número 13 da Flip 2015 e extraordinário encontro com David Hare. Todos sabemos que a política é teatro puro. E é verdade que o teatro pode ser também um instrumento político. E certamente é assim no caso do David Hare, sem dúvida um dos mais importantes dramaturgos contemporâneos, não só no Reino Unido, mas da língua inglesa. Com uma trajetória que começou em 1968, com a primeira peça, o David é autor de 30 peças teatrais, sempre engajadas com temas fundamentais da sociedade moderna. Por exemplo, o papel da igreja na peça Racing Demon, o papel da imprensa conservadora, na peça Pravda, o conflito entre compromisso social e capitalismo egoísta, Skylight, a implosão do Partido Trabalhista na peça The Absence of War, e as origens da invasão do Iraque na peça Stuff Happens. Além de dramaturgo, David é roteirista e foi indicado para os prêmios Oscar e Golden Globe pelos roteiros de filmes como As Horas, do Michael Cunningham, e O Leitor, do Bernard Schlink, baseado no romance do Bernard Schlink. Ele também dirigiu peças teatrais e até foi ator numa peça dele mesmo, um monólogo chamado Via Dolorosa. Em 1998, David foi nomeado Cavaleiro da Ordem Britânica. E não seria um exagero dizer que o panorama da dramaturgia britânica e, ainda além disso, o panorama da cultura britânica moderna não seria reconhecível hoje sem a contribuição fundamental do Sir David Hare. E então é um grande prazer ter ele aqui conosco hoje. So welcome, David.
Thank you.
It's very good to have you here. And so here we are in Paraty at this event. And Liz Calder, who was instrumental in creating Flip, is someone who you met in extraordinary circumstances. So I'd love to start off by you telling us how you first met Liz.
I first met Liz in 1990, and I was working in Paris and staying in a small hotel, and a friend of mine who knew how pleased I would be faxed me the front page of a special edition of the evening newspaper which announced that Margaret Thatcher had resigned. And this was wonderful news for anyone who had lived through the 1980s. And so I couldn't find anyone to share this news with except the girl on the desk, the hotel bureau, and I was so overexcited that my French went to pieces, because she said, "Why are you looking so happy?" And I said, "Margaret Thatcher kaput." And she said, "Assassiné?" I said, "No, elle a fait sa retraite." And then all day, I couldn't find anyone to share the news with. I was walking around Paris, and nobody seemed particularly excited by this news. And then when I got back to the hotel, I saw a woman whom I vaguely recognized and suspected must be a publisher. And she came up to me and said, "Have you heard this fantastic news?" And so suddenly, two English lunatics who didn't know each other were dancing together in the lobby of this hotel. But really, Margaret Thatcher had her revenge, because basically Liz and I have both lived in a country she rules ever since. We never got rid of her. Her spirit still rules the United Kingdom.
Well, that sets us up very nicely for our conversation. I'd like to take you back to the beginning of your career, because you started directing. And you were sort of a theatre director in the 60s, and you sort of fell into playwriting almost by accident.
Well, I fell into playwriting. I started a theatre group for entirely political reasons. I had a travelling theatre group which was trying to dramatize what we believed to be the terminal crisis in capitalism, and so we were travelling around the country presenting short, nasty, aggressive plays which were intended to upset people and then leave at once, as fast as possible, before active fists flew. And so, unfortunately, a writer who had promised to write a play for this portable theatre, it was called, and we played, this is now quite a familiar idea, but at the time in the 60s it was quite revolutionary. We played in prisons, we played in army camps, we played on floors, we played in canteens, we played anywhere, we didn't mind. Anywhere except theatres, really. But on a Wednesday, I was due to get a new play from a writer, and I got the news that they were not going to be able to deliver. And so I had 4 days to write a play on my knees, and so in order that we should have something to rehearse on the following Monday. And although the play was inevitably absolutely terrible, nevertheless, when I gave it to the actors, they did not seem unhappy. In other words, they had pages of dialogue in their hand. They looked at those pages, and I could see them go, "Oh, this is okay. We can speak this. This is actually speakable." And so I didn't know how to write plays, but I knew how to write dialogue. And that turned out to be a gift I didn't know I had. And the only advice I ever have for young people is when people ask, you may, like me, not know you have that gift. And it's worth trying out in every field, be that skiing or swimming or whatever. It's worth trying out to see if you have a gift you don't know you have. Because I turned out to have a gift I didn't know I had, and the discovery of it, in a way, was pure accident.
And the trick to that was writing dialogue that seemed authentic, even though it was very stylized.
Not so much that had a style to it. I think Virginia Woolf said that she spent 10 times as much time thinking about rhythm as she did about sense. And that sounds a kind of high-flown aesthetic remark. But actually, in a way, rhythm is sense. And unless you can create rhythm in language, you can't make language stick. Writing dramatic dialogue is no different in that sense. You're not imitating speech. It would be absolutely unbearable to imitate speech. If you listen to people in the street and how they talk, 10 minutes of listening to well, kind of, well, I like, if you actually put that down, that would be unbearable. But every dramatist has to find a style which is implicitly poetic, even if it isn't openly poetic. And so finding rhythm to language is no different for a playwright than it is, Combe Tabine the other night when he was talking said, I wrote the first sentence of the novel and I knew it had a rhythm that I could continue in. And so that's exactly the same for a playwright.
You've said elsewhere that some of your best work starts with a very strong image, so it's kind of a visual thing rather than an idea or a sentence. You go for the image. Is that right?
I think the least understood element in the theatre or in the performing arts is expectation. Expectation is a very powerful tool in the artist's armory, and it's not one that's used as much as it should be. And in the theatre, that means walking into the theatre, and now we no longer have curtains, seeing something that makes you go, oh, this is going to be interesting. And so I do have a painterly desire to create something on the stage which, when the audience look at it, they go, oh, this is going to be interesting. The example I give is of Plenty, which is a play I wrote at the end of the 1970s, which is about a woman who's fought in special operations in the Second World War. And she comes back from the war, and nothing in peacetime ever pleases her, whereas everything in the war pleased her because she saw the very best of people. She saw nobility in people while working for SOE, Special Operations Executive, behind the lines in France. And the play begins with the image of high windows that have light coming through them. She is sitting, rolling a cigarette on some empty boxes. The room has been stripped of all the furniture, and her naked husband is lying at her feet. And in comes a friend with a Chinese takeaway. Now, the actress who plays this part always curses me because there is absolutely nothing worse you can ask an actor to do than to roll a cigarette in the first 30 seconds of a play, because they're, rolling a cigarette in these is a real trial for an actor. No one can do it. But having said that, the minute I see that image in the theatre, I go, wow, what's that naked man doing lying next to that woman in an overcoat on these empty boxes with these high windows? And it's just as much a painting as a painting that you would see in a gallery. And so you're instantly, it's like the smell coming off good food. You just go, wow, I'd like to be in that place for a while and to find out what that image is about and how it came about.
Mm. You were very successful from the moment you put on your first play and have been ever since. And this has attracted sort of praise and also a great degree of hostility.
Yeah.
There was one literary critic who said, I wish David Hare would just go away. And so what is it that winds people up in your plays?
It's true. You say I was very successful. Actually, it would be truer to say that I was very controversial. Mm. And so people assume it's very like when I hear people attacking Jonathan Franzen for his novels. And they think that Jonathan Franzen, when he writes a novel, is saying, this is the way to write a novel. This is the future of the American novel. I am showing you how this novel should be done. Jonathan Franzen is making no such claim. He just happens to write a novel in a particular style. He leaves it free to anyone else who wants to write novels in any other style. And yet the level of attack that Franzen attracts, at least in the UK, is absolutely astonishing. But it's because it is somehow assumed that in achieving something in a particular style, he is therefore implicitly saying that other styles are invalid. But he's not saying any such thing. Similarly, when I said it would be great if the British theatre grew up, it would be great if political, social subjects could be included. It would be wonderful if we could not all write about our mothers and our love affairs and our, we didn't write plays about disillusionment in middle age and, those subjects and how awful it is to be a writer in North London and those subjects that people write about. How wonderful it would be if we wrote about the Chinese Revolution and if we wrote about aid to the Third World, and if we wrote about privatization of the railway system, and if we wrote about the diplomatic process leading up to the invasion of Iraq. That would air the room a little, wouldn't it? To put some new subject matter in. But of course, other people feel implicitly criticized by that. They feel, oh, he's on some mission. And so there's a feeling that because I want a particular kind of theatre for myself, because I would like this art form in which I work to be adult, that I therefore am moralizing. But I'm not moralizing, I'm just saying the whole thing will be more entertaining if it's versatile and can take in subject matter from the outside world of all kinds.
But you say you're not moralizing, but some of your plays do feel like sort of state of the nation statements. I mean, you are making a very strong political point, and so you're giving us the diagnosis.
Yeah, but it's a tradition in the British theatre. In other words, Shakespeare's known for some comedies which most people find extremely unfunny. He's known for some tragedies which are very great, but I think more and more these days he's appreciated for these incredible history plays he wrote. And these history plays were, if you want to use this horrible old phrase, state of the nation plays. That's exactly what Shakespeare wrote. He wrote these plays about what his country was like. And they were distinguished by ensemble. In other words, they didn't have heroes called Macbeth and King Lear, and it wasn't all about the bloke who was standing at the center of the stage. They were written for companies of 15. There were working class characters, there were lower middle class characters, there were tradespeople, there were lords, there were ladies, and there were kings and queens. And so his plays are not just about the interaction between the classes. There are always enough people that there are actually interaction within the classes as well. So he was writing this pioneering form, which is called State of the Nation. George Bernard Shaw was writing State of the Nation. In Ireland, Sean O'Casey, for goodness sake, was writing State of the Nation. So State of the Nation is just a way of saying non-psychological theatre. Theatre that isn't just about relationships and psychology, but which is about particular historical circumstances and social conditions in which people happen to find themselves, and in which you feel history blowing through the room.
I'd like to pick up on this idea of a peculiarly British tradition of theatre. There's a quote by Philip Roth, who said, "I write novels because I'm an American. If I were British, I'd write plays."
I think
what does that tell us about?
No, I think Philip was getting at something slightly different, which it is extremely controversial to say, particularly at a literary festival. So I say it very guardedly. And so if you can forget it as soon as I've said it, I'd be very grateful, since it will get me into a lot of trouble. But I think what Philip Roth meant when he said that was, he said, I'm a novelist because there are all sorts, because in America, I know who I'm in company with, meaning I'm in company, and he named, there's a person called Saul Bellow, there's a person called John Updike, there's a person called James Baldwin. I am in the company of them, so I understand what being a novelist is in America. Whereas he said, in England, I would not know how to be a novelist because I wouldn't know in whose company I was going to be. Okay, shoot me for saying it. But that is what he said.
That there is
he
no,
said I'd
no
be
great,
a playwright because I'd understand what I was as a playwright, because there I would be John Osborne, Harold Pinter, Tom Stoppard, and Carol Churchill, and Philip Roth. You know? So he'd know what he was, is what he's saying. And he went to the theatre when he lived in England. Philip went to the theatre all the time. I don't think he goes to the theatre in America.
I'd like to turn to one of your plays, Absence of War. I think this one may be of particular interest to a Brazilian audience because it's about the sort of implosion or self-destruction of the Labour Party in the early 90s. And this play was, it had a revival recently, just before the latest election, which led to the sort of implosion, self-destruction of the Labour Party. Tell us about the origins of that play.
What happened was that in 1992, the Labour Party, which had been out of power for a long time, 13 years, was expected to win the next election. And Neil Kinnock was the Labour leader. He was Welsh. He was deep in the traditions of old Labour, and yet he was a modernising figure. And he was expected to win the 1992 election. And because he was a theatre-goer, he was foolish enough to ask me to come to his strategy meetings and to go and see the group at 7 o'clock in the morning as they planned the day's strategy. Not everybody in the Labour Party was as happy about this as Neil was. And a lot of them were very angry that I was allowed in, so that they would all go into little groups in the corner of the room to try and talk so that I wouldn't overhear, because nobody really trusted me. One of the things about an election campaign is that everybody becomes very paranoid, and they're paranoid that word of how they're going to fight the election is going to get out. But they had no need to be. I was totally on their side, and I was also totally trustworthy. Nothing leaked. But the particular circumstances of that election were that Neil Kinnock, having been expected to win it, lost it. And he lost it for one reason only, which he himself admits to, that when people looked at him, they did not believe he could be Prime Minister. It was a judgment not on the party, but on him. And as a playwright who had myself failed often in front of 200 people, 300 people, 400 people, 800 people, with a play that failed to convince the audience, I could not imagine, or rather I totally sympathized with, what it would be like for 30 million people to say, you are not suitable to be Prime Minister, which is the message Neil Kinnock had to deal with on a personal level. So it just made it, for me, a wonderful subject to write about. But the second thing that was going on was, and which may be more familiar here, is the decay of the Labour Party itself. In other words, when the Labour Party served a cause, the clue is in the name. It was called the Labour Party. It was organised around Labour, because Labour, everyone who worked in the industrial cities and in the big industries, had a common cause, and it was understood what that cause was, to organise against the employers on behalf of the employees and to represent organised labour. Now that the world has changed so much, by the early 1990s, the cities were no longer the centres of employment in the way they had been. The great industries had gone, the car industry, the steel, everything had gone. So the ties that held the left together were disappearing. It's a very different thing to get together a group of people who say they're left-wing, they claim to be left-wing, but what do they have in common? Nothing. They went to universities, they studied politics, they have, they drink cappuccinos, they read policy papers, they wear nice clothes, they go on nice holidays, and they say, we're the left. But that's a very different thing, because there isn't an embodied class interest which everybody understands and which creates loyalty to a cause. And so obviously what we've seen throughout the Western world, as we've seen the atomization of industry and everybody moving into service industries, becoming self-employed, part-time workers, internships, everything, is that there doesn't seem to be a left-wing party which is able to embody, in Britain, a common cause and which is held together by a common understanding. Mm. And the play dramatizes that. It dramatizes it in 1992. It was just revived in 2015, and everybody who went to it just said, this could have been written today.
Mm. Did Neil Kinnock go to see it?
He went to see it, and he described it as the 3 most uncomfortable hours of his life. Mm. But I admired him so much for going. And I'm going to test the translators at this point. He wrote me a letter, and in protest, I wrote back and said, he said I hated the play because it was true. There was nothing in the play that wasn't true. And I said, yeah, but Neil, I represented you as noble. And he said, yeah, you represented me as a noble numbskull. I don't know how we translate that. Meaning a noble idiot, really.
I'm fascinated by the idea that you approach some of your plays with this sort of documentary effort. So this is documentary theater. You were attending the sort of strategy committee meetings and you're finding out how policy was made. For your trilogy, about the Weatherby trilogy, it was, these are films about a spy. You were interviewing spies. So I'm fascinated by this element of your process. Tell us about the research that goes into...
Well, the process is just that people speak very freely to playwrights. And they speak much more freely to playwrights than they do to journalists. And the reason they'll speak to a playwright is that they know it's off the record, it's unattributable, and whatever they say is going to be buried so deep in the play that nobody is ever going to be able to find out who I've spoken to. Obviously, when I wrote about the British security services, wrote 3 television films about the British security services, then, you know, I spoke to people who worked within the security services. They can speak to me because I am never going to name them. I'm never going to indicate that what their names are or anything like that. They're completely safe. And when I wrote Stuff Happens, which is the play about the diplomatic process leading up to the invasion of Iraq, it was almost like being a priest. In other words, people were so keen who had been at the center of those events to get stuff off their chest and to be able to talk to somebody in the confessional, so to speak. Because obviously those events, which in Britain were so traumatic that I don't think British politics and British national life has still recovered from them. In whatever it is, 12 years later, the argument goes on. There's still, by the way, a public inquiry into how we went to war. The public inquiry has lasted longer than the war, and there is a possibility that its conclusions will never be published because it is so contentious. So obviously, when you go round 3 months, 6 months, 9 months after these events, in which we simply kowtowed to American policy and went to war illegally, people are very keen to talk to you because they know they can talk to you and get stuff off their chest that they can't get off to other people.
And I understand that people, for instance, in the National Health Service, who think, this is a mess, please, David, come and talk to us, and then, in the expectation that you may put this into a play.
Yeah, well, because I've written plays about the Church of England, the privatization of the railway system, the legal system, the Labour Party, so interest groups do ring me up and say, come and do us. And I once was at a cricket match, sitting next to the Queen's secretary. And he said to me, very surprisingly, he said, I don't suppose you've ever thought of doing us, have you? I said, I must admit, it's never been high on my list, no. And he said, well, if you ever do, here's my card and give me a ring and we'll help you. I thought, a kamikaze press secretary, I thought.
Well, there's a thought. I'd like to turn out to Via Dolorosa, which is quite a remarkable episode in your career. This is a play, it's a monologue based on, or which you wrote following a visit to Jerusalem and Palestine. Tell us about the process of writing that play and then quite uniquely sort of acting in it.
Well, what happened was that I was sent by a theatre, the Royal Court Theatre, which I hope everybody here has heard of, because it's one of the most remarkable theatres in the world. It's the theatre of John Osborne, and it's the theatre that more or less invented the modern British play. And their international department asked me to go and write a play about the Mandate period. That's the period when the British controlled Palestine. And I went out there, and in theory, I was meant to be researching that. And I was totally uninterested, and I was just so taken aback, both by Israel and by the Palestinian territories, that I thought, I'm not going to do a boring old play about the mandate. I'm just going to do a play about how this situation is now. But the idea of dramatizing it seemed to me ridiculous. In other words, theatre, this is one of the subjects with which I thought theatre couldn't cope. Because as soon as I thought of getting some Jewish actors in London together to be Israelis, and getting, well, you couldn't get Palestinians together, there wouldn't be enough Palestinian actors in London, so you'd get a light-skinned Pakistani, or you'd get an Egyptian, and you'd get them all standing at crossroads holding machine guns, and you just had an image of absolute horror and falsity. And I've seen plays like that, and they're all terrible. Plays where people are carrying machine guns and go, you know, you just go, that is untrue. I don't believe that. It doesn't represent the vitality and the danger of what I saw. It's just theatre. So I had this problem of how do I get over the falsity of theatre. So it seemed to me the only way I could do it was as a monologue, and it also seemed to me that it had to be a monologue which I delivered. Because basically, in a subject as contentious as that, the question the audience is asking all the time is, do I trust the witness? Am I being told the truth? Now, the only way you can test the witness is for the witness to stand in front of you. So Stephen Daldry was the director, and he's the director with whom I then made the films. Out of this relationship came The Hours and The Reader, the two films that we made together. But Stephen Daldry was the director who I didn't know. I'd barely met him. And I came back and I said to him, I've got very bad news. It's a monologue. He said, yeah, that's very bad news. And I said, the really bad news is I've got to deliver it and I can't act. So you've got to teach me to act. And then he did get a glint. He went, great, I can teach you to act and you'll do anything I say. And I said, well, of course I'll do anything you say because I don't know how to act. So all I can do is trust you. And often when I was acting, I felt that it was an elaborate practical joke of Stephen's, you know? I was doing all this, you know, all this stuff, and I was going, is this really convincing you? Because it's not convincing me, you know. And there was a particularly objectionable moment when Jerusalem arrived in the play. In other words, an image of Jerusalem arrived. And in the play, I had to look at this image of the Golden Dome and Jerusalem, and I had to be very moved by it. I had to look at this thing and say, you know, some line about how incredibly moved I was to see this thing. And, you know, I said to Stephen, this feels absolutely horrible. He said, why? I said, because I'm pretending to be moved by seeing this piece of scenery flying in. And I'm not remotely moved by this piece of scenery flying in. And he said, yeah, that's what we call acting. I said, well, all I can tell you is it feels horrible. It feels horrible because what you're really asking me is to fake. He said, yeah, acting. I said, oh, I get it now. You pretend to have an emotion you don't have. It's a form of sort of organized dishonesty, is it? He said, yep, you got it. And so from then on, in a way, I was liberated, but I didn't go home feeling terribly happy every night.
Mm-hmm. So what did you learn about acting and the actor's craft?
What did I not learn? I learned an awful lot. Because, first of all, we did the play in London, and then we went and did the play in New York, and then I started doing the play in other places. And so, you know, I learned all those things that when previously an actor had said to me, you know, I don't like this table being, what is that, about 12 inches away from this chair. And the actor would say, I'm very uncomfortable with this chair being 12 inches away. Can it be 9 inches away? And I'd go, okay, yeah. You can have the chair a little closer if you like. And, you know, I'd pretend to understand. I'd say, yeah. Are you feeling better now? And the actor would say, yeah, I'm much more comfortable now. Now that glass, you know, there, that feels much better now. I'm much happier. And yet, once I started doing it, I was doing exactly that. I'd be saying, I don't like this plank. You know, this plank seems to be is there a chance it could just be at a slight angle, that plank, and I'd be much more comfortable? And you turn into this neurotic. about your environment. It's like some terrible collector who has to have all their collection pieces in the right places, and then they're comfortable. But it makes me much more tolerant of actors now when they demand that their environment be exactly the way they want it.
So you do feel more sympathy?
Oh, much more sympathy, yeah.
You described it as...
it was very, very good for me. Because I'd worked in the theatre for almost 30 years without ever knowing what it was like to act. I've always loved actors, and I loved their company. And one of the things about being a playwright is it's a collaborative art. And so I adore actors. And I get very angry in England where actors are not respected. They're told that they shouldn't interfere in politics, and what are they doing, signing letters about causes, and how dare they complain about Guantanamo. And journalists go, that's our job. We write about Guantanamo. What are actors doing? They're doing, having opinions. And so there's this attitude that in Britain that actors are looked down on as being stupid and shouldn't interfere in the life. I don't know if it's the same here. But I love them, but I had not really understood their lives.
During this period, you kept a diary, which you later published, in which you are sort of tremendously rude about your director and the rest of the ensemble. Why did you decide you wanted to keep this diary?
I didn't really. I just wanted to digest the experience every night because it was so discombobulating that I had to just set down every night these wild feelings I was having at performing. And so that's why I did it. The thing I learned by publishing a book, which everyone here who has published a book will know well, which I didn't know but came with the force of revelation because it was sort of the first book I'd ever published. The people that you set out to offend, you totally unoffended. They say, oh, loved the book. And you thought, well, why did you love the book? I tried to be as rude about you as I possibly could. Whereas the people you had no intention of offending said, I'd never speak to you again. And I thought, well, I was perfectly nice about you. And so I just don't understand what it is that does or doesn't offend people in representation.
Some of the things you document in your diary and some of the things you've described now make me wonder about the question of, sort of ownership of a play. Because there's a playwright, there's a director, there's an actor or actress, all of them claiming this thing, rightly or perhaps wrongly, as their own. So how do you negotiate that?
Well, ownership is a legal issue. We have contracts. We have laws. So, sorry. In the theatre, the playwright owns the play.
But does that mean you tell a director?
No. In the cinema and in television, I am a hired hand. I sell my labor. I do not own the copyright. So the reason the writer is down the pecking order in Hollywood is because I am simply one more hired hand. The director is hired, the playwright is hired, the writer is hired, the actors are hired. I work for the company that owns my work. Every word I write, they own. I don't own it. That was a Writers' Guild agreement in the 1930s. So there's nothing I can do about that. So, it's a very basic fact. If you want to work in the theatre, you can close the production down if they do not say every word you want them to say. Harold Pinter went to see a production of Old Times, directed by Visconti. Visconti was one of the greatest directors in the world. He'd moved some lines around, he'd moved some scenes around. Harold Pinter just closed the production down in Rome and said, that's not my play. You can do another play, but you can't do it and call it Old Times by Harold Pinter. So, you're accommodating, and of course, if you love collaboration as I do, you're listening all the time. You're crazy not to listen to the actors, because the actors are going to tell you what they're uncomfortable with, and good actors will help you improve it, and I'll rewrite it all the time to make it better. But ultimately, no, the reason writers go on working for the theatre and love the theatre is because legally it's ours.
You've compared actors, in your plays at least, to musicians. reading or playing sheet music, that they have to play every note.
Yeah. But I can't bear it if an actor gets a word wrong. But that's because the mystery of style I was talking about earlier, you know, the mystery, style is a complete mystery. You know, why was Combe to been pleased with that first sentence? He doesn't know. I don't know. You know, the cliche is, as a playwright, is to say that when you begin to write, the characters take over. That's always the cliche. Oh, I thought I was going to write this, but instead the characters took over. But what would be truer to say is that every single element takes over. The scene that you had intended to set there finds itself being set there. A line pleases you or displeases you for no reason that you can possibly explain. Oh, that line seems right for that character to say at that point. I have no idea why. I don't know why. But it's as mysterious as why a painting. Ask Rothko to explain why a Rothko looks like a Rothko. You know, he just knows when it pleases him. So style is a mystery. And if you don't respect style as an actor and see it not as limitation, but as liberation, I always have a rather Nazi phrase to actors, which is beyond discipline, freedom. If you accept the discipline, then you will find freedom beyond. But if you don't accept the discipline of style, it'll all just be an unholy mess on the stage.
So method acting and all these things, which are very popular in the US, don't go.
I've worked with great method actors. You know, in The Hours, Ed Harris, who plays a man dying of AIDS in the film of The Hours, in which Ed gives the most astonishing performance. Ed is a compulsive method actor, to a point where, at the film studio at lunchtime, Pinewood, I saw this man in a dressing gown and a Zimmer frame walking very slowly to see the rushes in the theatre, to see the dailies, to see the thing. I go, what is this? Oh, that's Ed Harris staying in character during lunch hour to walk on a Zimmer frame because he's dying of AIDS. And everyone at the film studio is looking at him going, is Ed Harris all right? I didn't know Ed Harris was dying of AIDS. And, you know, they're all staring at him because he does that. But Ed Harris will say every single word you wrote beautifully. The method, and also, I don't care by what means he achieves that performance. If he wants to do that, I mean, he starved himself for 4 months. He didn't eat for 4 months before he started. He drank water only for 4 months before he played the part. And it's an exquisite performance. And every single word I wrote is said.
Mm. Speaking of film, I read an interview with you which quoted you saying to an audience of screenwriters that you cannot write a screenplay. Come on.
Did I say that?
Yes.
When did I say that?
Well, you were speaking to an audience of playwrights in America, screenwriters, and you said, I cannot write a screenplay.
No, it's true that I went through a period in which my work for film got worse and worse. Mm. And I made some films, one of which I am ashamed to say was shown at the Rio Film Festival. And I made some films in the 1980s with which I was extremely discontented.
Which ones were those?
I made 3 films in the 80s, Weatherby with Vanessa Redgrave, Paris by Night with Charlotte Rampling, Strapless with Blair Brown and Bruno Ganz. And none of those films really... I was very, very frustrated by these films and felt this is not for me. And then the person who saved me was Louis Malle. And I wrote a film for Louis Malle called Damage. And what he did, which is an incredible method for those of you who ever want to write a film, he would sit me down every morning and say, it was based on a book, tell me the story of the film. And I would go, well, there's this Conservative MP, blah, 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 blah. And he'd say, no, what sort of Conservative MP? Just tell me, okay, no, that doesn't sound right. And he'd stop you every 10 seconds to ask what you meant by. And then you go back and reformulate. Now, we did this for 3 hours, during which I thought I was going to have a nervous breakdown because it was driving me absolutely nuts. We stop and have lunch, and I say, okay, now we'll resume where we left off. He said, no, go back to the beginning. Go back to the beginning. So I'd start again. And this went on for 10 days. And it was like being in a prison camp. You know, every morning I would tell Louis Malle the story of the film. And, slowly I got into it. After about 5 days, I began to quite enjoy it, right? And finally, at the end of the process, I could tell him the story of the film in approximately 25 minutes, in a form that both of us agreed. And that was the story, and it was watertight. And he just said to me, well, you've done it now, go and write it. We've done the job, because you've structured it, it's been interrogated, it's completely robust. There is no objection to it that is imaginable, because we have dealt with every possible objection in advance. Now you can go and write the dialogue, but the dialogue will just be these little extra baubles that you hang on this completely tight string, because we've created that string together. And it was like camp, really. I mean, it was therapy for me, because it made me understand the structure of film and how you must structure. And Louis saved me, really, as a screenwriter, and I owe a huge amount to him.
So you're obviously feeling sort of very down on film. In this same interview, you describe film as the most uneven of art forms. Yeah,
I was very annoyed, because when Louis Malle died, and I worship Louis Malle, he was described in his obituary as an uneven filmmaker. And I just said, has anybody ever heard of an even filmmaker? Did anybody ever make exclusively good films? I mean, I've seen some of Hitchcock's films. Some of Hitchcock's films are terrible. Steven Spielberg has made some of the worst films ever made. He's also made some of the best films ever made. Orson Welles made some of the best films ever made. He also made some of the worst films ever made. It is in the nature of film, because it's such a volatile medium, that the work of all filmmakers is wildly uneven. Uneven just goes with the job.
And tell us about the difference between writing for the stage and writing for the screen, whether it's television or film.
The difference? Well, the difference is, of course, in a play, I work entirely on my own in my room. I don't accept a commission. I don't tell anybody what it's going to be about. So when I hand it over, it's a gift. And everybody goes, oh, this is marvelous. I didn't know you were writing a play about this or that, And they're pleased to get it. If you write a film, everyone goes, oh, I didn't think it was going to be like this, because they know what the subject's going to be, because they can't pay you in advance unless they know what the subject's going to be. So they say, oh, I didn't think it was going to be like this. Oh, I thought it was going to be much funnier than this. Oh, I thought it was going to be much sexier than this. Oh, I didn't see that character like that. I saw it like this. And so what I always say about screenwriting is that if you go to a meeting and something's got to be decided by 12 people, the stupidest thing you can do is speak first. All powerful people wait to speak at the end. All the powerful people are the people who say, well, it's been very interesting to hear these views, but I will pull all these views together, and this is what we're going to do, Only the idiot goes first. The idiot is the screenwriter. Because you are the person who says, well, this is how I see the film. Whereupon, a load of people come and shoot your vision down. If you are adapting a book, and it's particularly true on the reader, I knew exactly how I wanted the reader to be. It took me approximately 8 weeks to write it. I'd read it 10 years previously. I knew how to do it the minute I read it. Anthony Minghella had the rights. He wouldn't give me the rights. I kept saying, Anthony, you're never going to make this film. Give it to me. I know how to do it. He'd go, no, I'm going to work out how to do it. I said, you're never going to work out how to do it. I know how to do it. Give it to me, right? 10 years he said no. He finally came to me and said, I'll give you 1 year to get this made, and you can have the rights for 1 year. I said, okay, that's fine. No problem for me. I know how to do it. I absolutely knew how to do it. I did it. Anthony Minghella said, oh, you really did know how to do it, didn't you? But I then spent 10 times the amount of time doing what I call lawyering for a work of art than I did making the work of art. You have to be the advocate. And so you will notice of Hollywood screenwriters, they're all incredibly articulate because they're lawyers. They've got a client, the client is the script, and they're going to try and get their client through the process undamaged. And meanwhile, everybody else is going to go, well, I see it like this, I see it like that, oh, I think it's going to be like this. And you've got to defend your client. And my client is my script. So I'm a lawyer when I write screenplays.
You've written for television as well, and I know that you admire TV drama, sort of contemporary TV drama, in particular American TV drama. What do you find
same
so
reasons.
compelling?
Just clearly, you know, we can all see in Mad Men and The Wire and in Breaking Bad and in, there's a French one I love called Spiral, The Killing, The Bridge, all these, the writer is in charge. American television is structured so that in Mad Men, the person who runs Mad Men is the writer. They are the producer. And so, you know, the reason that there's been this renaissance of American television in particular, but also to a degree in Europe, is that the writer is again allowed to do what writers do. And obviously, in particular, what they do is narrative. And I believe Salman Rushdie said that if he was starting out now, he would be a television writer, not a novelist, because narrative now resides in television. And the danger of the novel, I would have thought, I don't know why I should care, but, you know, the danger of the novel is that it starts trying to do things that, you know, simply things that television can't do. In other words, it becomes so literary as to be kind of irrelevant to people's lives when they can get great fiction from television.
We have some questions already coming in. Virginia asks, how do you deal with bad critics or bad reviews?
Well, I have a great deal of experience. I think it's, who is it? Oh, it's Stefan Zweig. Stefan Zweig said that a writer deserves worthy adversaries. I've occasionally felt my adversaries were worthy. When your work is picked apart by Pauline Kael, who was a great film critic, I mean, even I had to laugh because she was so witty that when she tore me to pieces, it was actually it was so wittily written. But I have a rule, which is that if the critic can't write an English sentence, probably it's better not to read them, you know. So I have no respect for critics who can't write English. You just got to be able to handle language yourself to be entitled to be a critic. And so this disqualifies large numbers of people who attack me.
This is a question from Rafael Juvenal. It's a short question. What do you think of Margaret Thatcher?
Well, as I said at the very beginning, she won. You know, basically, we live in a Thatcherite country. So nothing, you know, she was in power for 10 or 12 years, and then, you know, she was in our terms the engine of neoliberalism. She was the person who, you know, replaced a kind of caring, compassionate conservatism that came out of the Second World War, where officers fought alongside men and came back wanting to create a welfare state on both sides, in Labour and Conservative parties. And she was somebody who simply admired the market, loved the market, thought the market was bracing, and also thought that the market was just. And so she was the agent of that philosophy in Britain, and obviously a peculiarly brilliant agent of that philosophy. And so that philosophy has held in Britain, as it is held in most Western European countries. And this weekend, we will discover whether Greece can follow another path, is even allowed to follow another path, or has to conform to neoliberal economics with all its insane injustices and inequalities. So obviously Thatcher is a hugely significant figure in British history, but she's a really terrible Prime Minister. And I was asked to write the film The Iron Lady, which was a film which was made about her, and I flatly refused, since I don't think I wanted to decorate her myth anymore. It doesn't need any more decoration.
Speaking of things you've turned down, this is something I wanted to confirm. Maybe this is the right place to do it. You turned down an opportunity to write Star Wars, one of the latest installments?
Star Wars, yeah.
Yes.
Well, no, that's not strictly accurate. I turned down the chance to write and direct Star Wars.
Ah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Star Wars 4.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is the new
And 5.
trilogy.
I was offered 5 as well, I forgot.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I don't know how that slipped my mind. It did.
Well done, you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing was that George Lucas, I knew George Lucas a little, and George Lucas said to me, one of the things I've noticed about you, David, is you like actors very much. And I said, I do. And he said, I don't really understand actors. Could you come along and direct the actors while I do the shots? And I said, George, I don't think that arrangement's going to work. And I also made a joke that he didn't think was funny. This was Star Wars 4. He said, would you like to write Star Wars 4? And I said, oh my God, George, would I have to watch numbers 1 to 3?
Thank you. My doubt is solved now. Someone asks, do you consider Stanley Kubrick an uneven filmmaker?
What?
Do you consider Stanley Kubrick an uneven filmmaker?
Have you seen Eyes Wide Shut?
I have, yes. Okay. Moving on. Paolo Werneck asks, did you meet Kenneth Tynan?
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit?
Kenneth Tynan, well, he was a great critic. Kenneth Tynan was exactly the kind of critic that I was talking about, the worthy adversary. And Ken was a man who was discontented with criticism. You could argue that the great critics have always been the ones who've moved on. You know, George Bernard Shaw was a great music critic, but he gave up music criticism in order to become a playwright. And Kenneth Tynan was discontented with criticism. Ken was a very amusing man, very funny man, very rich, complicated man, who just felt finally that theatre criticism was an undignified way to spend his whole life. And I think he was lucky enough. You know, all great critics need a movement with which to identify, so that, in other words, you know, your luck, Pauline Kael's luck, so to speak, was to be the critic of the American cinema of the 1970s, of Coppola and Scorsese and, you know, Brian De Palma and all these great filmmakers who suddenly appeared. She was their critic. Similarly, Clement Greenberg was the abstract expressionist critic. So a critic, just like a writer, is looking for a cause to attach themselves to, something to believe in, that they can speak for, and speak wonderfully for. In England, there was a great art critic called David Sylvester. David Sylvester was lucky enough to be around when Francis Bacon and Lucian Freud were around. David Sylvester wrote wonderfully because Bacon was worth writing wonderfully about. And Ken wrote wonderfully because John Osborne arrived, Harold Pinter arrived, Samuel Beckett arrived, and there was lots that was wonderful to write about, and Ken could speak for them, and for Brecht. And Ken really was the champion of Brecht in England. Once he left being a critic, he was a lot unhappier, unfortunately, and died tragically early at the age of 53.
Thank you. Armando asks,
But he would adore the idea that in Paraty, 30 years after his death, we're talking about him, and I'm thrilled we've had the chance to. Thank you.
Thank you. Armando asks, would you recommend a rebranding of Labour Party or Conservative Party? Rebranding, changing the names as they no longer represent those views.
If I knew the answer to this question, who in the Western world knows the answer to this question? Certainly in Europe and in America, nobody knows the answer to what you now do. You know, I wrote a play about the financial crisis, The Power of Yes. It's proved that the free market, you know, even people who believe in the free market admit that the free market model no longer works. That's what we learned in 2007 and 2008. The economists at the University of Chicago, who were all disciples of Milton Friedman, after 2008 said, back to the drawing board. They were their words. And when they said Milton Friedman is responsible for this, they said, yes, admittedly, this model didn't work any better than any other model has ever worked. We need a new model. And yet, for some reason, Western politicians have decided that we don't need a new model, and that the people who caused the financial crisis, the banks, the financial institutions, should be rewarded for causing the financial crisis, and the people who were not responsible for the financial crisis should be punished for being the victims of the financial crisis. Now, how you unpick that one and how you start to create popular movements that will resist that idea is the drama that we're seeing in Greece. But they are finding that the neoliberal free marketeers are insisting that that is reality and that every country must live with that reality and with the huge inequalities that are created by that reality. How you start a political party which will retool capitalism is a question, as they say in England, above my pay grade.
There's a famous quote by Stendhal that politics in a literary work is like a pistol fired in the middle of a concert. And I've wondered how you balance the political, the stuff you're talking about just now, and the personal. In a play like Skylight, for instance, you're trying to make an argument, but how do we know that it's not because we like one character more than the other, if you see what I mean? We sympathize with a character because the character is sympathetic, not because, not necessarily because she makes the case more convincingly. How do you avoid that, falling into that trap?
You just never know. I mean, the great thing about theatre is its unknowability. You write a character who you think is terribly amusing and that everyone's going to love the jokes, and there's complete silence. They're received frostily. And then some character who seems to you completely uninteresting suddenly seems to be the crucible holding the feeling of the play in a way that you had absolutely never predicted. This is why the first preview for any playwright is the most exciting night of the whole thing, because that's the night when you basically learn what it is you've written and what people are going to feel about it. Of course, it's going to change. It's going to change according to where it's presented, how well it's done, who's in the audience, what kind of people come to see it, what class of person comes to see it, what age of person comes to see it. That'll affect the reaction. But the basic feelings don't change yet you feel audiences either saying, yes, this makes sense to me, or no, this makes absolutely no sense to me. I wrote one play which I adore, which I have never been able to get the audience to enjoy. I can't see anything wrong with it. To me, it seems just as good as my other plays, and yet when it's performed, it unfailingly flops.
Which one is this?
My Zinc Bed, which is a play about alcoholism, which I adore. It's about the philosophical problems of addiction. And I love this play, and yet I have to accept the fact that it fails to communicate to an audience. I have no idea. I've sat through many audiences who've rejected the play, and I have no idea why they do. I have absolutely no idea. But I can feel that rejection coming from them. And that, you know, that's one of the things about being a playwright. If you want to be a playwright, you're going to have some absolutely terrible evenings at your own work. And that you've got to be up for.
Some evenings where you can hear a cricket singing like that one that was... Did you hear that? Cricket. Somebody's phone. This is a question that I find interesting, and you may disagree with it. Somebody has suggested that this renaissance in sort of TV drama in America has to do with the fact that Kevin Spacey spent so much time living in London and then moved back to the US and brought something with him.
Gosh, that's an ingenious theory. That's the first time I've ever heard that theory. No, Kevin Spacey brings with him, you know, the status of a immensely brilliant film actor who has woken up and realized that the more interesting work in America may be going on in television. And I do think, I think his prestige and standing lends television something, but I think, frankly, American television would have got on and transformed itself without Kevin Spacey as well.
I'd like to end with this question. What did other actors think about your acting on Via Dolorosa?
The best comment I ever had on my acting, and I'm very proud of this, was that Paul Newman came to see the play in New York. And afterwards he came round to see me and he said, yeah, I really enjoyed your acting. It's great. It's really good. He said, it was kind of like when a 3-year-old gets up at a party.
Simon Callow, the British actor Simon Callow, who many people may remember from 3 Weddings and a Funeral.
Yeah.
He gave you a good write-up.
I think Simon Callow said that it was very brave of me to stand up in public unprotected by technique.
David, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.